We live in a tumultuous time in American history. People sometimes ask me what decade in American history most resembles the decade we've just been living through. And I tell them there's no question. It's the 1930s. That's right. I said the 1930s. I mean, you think about it. Both of these decades were lived out in the shadow of a great financial crisis, right? The global financial crisis, 1929, both were characterized by slow and disappointing economic growth. Both saw the underemployment of labor and capital, the emergence of surprising new trends like fears of deflation, which of course we hadn't seen before the last decade since the 1930s. Both saw new threats such as competitive devaluation, what in the 1930s we called beggar thy neighbor policies, threatened to disrupt, as we've already seen disrupted in the last decade, the rising trend in global trade. Both saw the rising gap between the rich and poor, the marginalization of working class Americans, fears about future living standards. Geopolitically, we see strong parallels as well. Think of the rise of nationalism globally in general, and think more specifically of the rise of right-wing populism. Again, we haven't seen that since the 30s. We've seen it recently. Think of the rise around the world of authoritarian regimes who seem to be enjoying rising popular appeal as they exert their will in their own regions without the interference of any larger concert of nations. The 1930s played out in the dissolution of the League of Nations, and today we see ourselves where the UN and the United States no longer seem to play as active a role in global affairs. This is an era that the geopolitical advisor and strategist Ian Bremmer calls a G0 world. It's every nation for itself. Social trends as well, we see parallels. The rise in multi-generational family living, the decline in home ownership, the decline in fertility rates around the world. We certainly see that in America. Changes in attitudes of voters toward their leaders. We want leaders who suddenly can exert authority. We want leaders to take charge. We no longer want processes and abstractions and market mechanisms. We want people who guarantee results. We've seen that in Europe in the elections there. We've obviously seen it here. Think more recently of the election of Donald Trump in 2016, who in his inauguration speech talked about American carnage, rusted out factories scattered like tombstones across the landscape of our nation. When in history have we seen such a polarizing, iconoclastic leader take charge of this country? And this all, I think, reflects the kind of uncertainty that we're looking at today. Well, this is all part of a pattern, and it's a pattern that's gone back centuries in Anglo-American history. I think it frankly characterizes the history of many countries around the world today, and that is a pattern of huge political and civic upheavals happening at the intervals of about the length of a long human lifetime, about every 80 or 90 years or so. And when we saw that, and we've seen that in sort of Anglo-American history going back to the Glorious Revolution in the late 17th century, the American Revolution in the late 18th century, the Civil War, the Great Depression, World War II, and here we are today. Like nature's four seasons, the cycles of history follow a natural rhythm or pattern. Over the last 5 centuries, Anglo-American society has entered a new era, a new turning, every 2 decades or so. At the start of each turning, people change how they feel about themselves, the culture, the nation, and the future. Turnings come in cycles of 4. Each cycle spans the length of a long human life, roughly 80 to 100 years, or the unit of time the ancients called the saeculum. The first turning is called a high. This is an era when institutions are strong and individualism is weak. Society is confident about where it wants to go collectively, even if those outside the majoritarian center feel stifled by the conformity. America's most recent first turning was the post-World War II American high, beginning in 1946 and ending with the assassination of John Kennedy in 1963, a key life cycle marker for today's older Americans. The second turning is an awakening. This is an era when institutions are attacked in the name of personal and spiritual autonomy. Just when society is reaching its high tide of public progress, people suddenly tire of social discipline and want to recapture a sense of inner authenticity. Young activists and spiritualists look back at the previous high as an era of cultural poverty. America's most recent awakening was the consciousness revolution, which spanned from the campus and inner city revolts in the mid-1960s to the tax revolts of the early 1980s. The third turning is an unraveling. The mood of this era is in many ways the opposite of a high. Institutions are weak and distrusted, while individualism is strong and flourishing. Highs follow crises, which teach the lesson that society must coalesce and build. Unravelings follow awakenings, which teach the lesson that society must atomize and enjoy. America's most recent unraveling was the long boom in culture wars beginning in the early 1980s and probably ending in 2008. The era opened with triumphant morning in America individualism and drifted toward a pervasive distrust of institutions and leaders, an edgy popular culture, and the splitting of national consensus into competing values camps, red and blue. And finally, we enter the fourth turning, which is a crisis. This is an era in which America's institutional life is torn down and rebuilt from the ground up, always in response to a perceived threat to the nation's very survival. Civic authority revives, cultural expression finds a community purpose, and people begin to locate themselves as members of a larger group. In every instance, fourth turnings have eventually become new founding moments in America's history, refreshing and redefining the national identity. Currently, this period began in 2008 with the global financial crisis and the deepening of the war on terror, and will extend to around 2030. What precipitates each turning is the aging of social generations into their next phase of life. Each new generation carries with it a generational archetype, a set of common attitudes and behaviors that are shaped by their location and history and distinguish them from their parents. These archetypes show up throughout history in a recurring order as children seek to obey or rebel against their parents. In fact, there is a symbiotic relationship between historical events and how these generations react, shape, or even cause those events as a direct consequence of the generational archetypes. We have names and traits for each of these four archetypes, and ultimately each turning is defined by the generation that comes of age during that period. The four generational archetypes are prophets, nomads, heroes, and artists. Prophets grow up as increasingly indulged post-crisis children, come of age as the narcissistic young crusaders of the awakening. These individuals become moralistic midlifers, emerge as the wise elders guiding the next crisis. The most recent example is the baby boomer generation. Nomads grow up as underprotected children during an awakening, coming of age as the alienated young adults of a post-awakening world. These individuals mellow into pragmatic midlife leaders during a crisis and age into tough post-crisis elders. The most recent example is Generation X. Heroes grow up as increasingly protected post-awakening children, coming of age as the heroic young team workers of a crisis. Heroes demonstrate hubris as energetic midlifers and emerge as powerful elders attacked by the next awakening. The most recent example is the millennial generation. Artists grow up as overprotected children during a crisis, come of age as the sensible young adults of a post-crisis world. Artists eventually break free as indecisive midlife leaders during an awakening and age into empathic post-awakening elders. The most recent example is the Homelander generation. So what does all this say about our future? Well, in our paradigm, America has entered the fourth turning. What can we say about fourth turnings? We're here in 2016. Each turning lasts around 22 years, so this turning is going to last until about the year 2030. So we're not quite halfway through yet. Now, this is the winter of history. It's a time of creative destruction of public institutions. We're going to radically change, ultimately, when we get out the other end of this thing, our politics, our economics, our sense of what we need in terms of public infrastructure in our lives. And very much of that is going to be shaped by the values and aspirations of the rising millennial generation. But what do we know of the morphology of these turnings? Well, it starts with the catalyst. And of course, the catalyst was Like 1929, it was 2008. A sudden shock to our system. Say, okay, we're in a new place now. You know, we're not in Kansas anymore. We have a whole new sense of where we need to go as a nation. We suddenly shocked out of our third turning individualism, celebrity circuses, and whatever we thought about back then. Things are going to be different now. Families are suddenly aware that they're not going to do as well as their parents. We're suddenly see that our role in the world maybe is not what we expected. That's the first thing. And that's already happened. The other three phases of the fourth turning haven't happened yet. One, which will soon happen, is what we call the regeneracy. This is when distrust reaches its low point and we suddenly begin to coalesce around something, some leader, some movement we began to feel positive about as a fulcrum, as some point at which we can begin to find increasing trust in someone who can piece together institutions that can make sense again. And we will wait to see who that is. People sometimes ask me, is it Donald Trump? Is it the person who's going to follow Donald Trump? I mean, heck, you go onto London betting sites and there's a 50-50 chance they're saying that Donald Trump could be impeached or resign before 4 years are over. So it may be the replacement. I don't know. I don't make predictions that way, but I'm just telling you what it says about who it is. Extreme volatility in politics, which is a huge contrast between the lack of volatility right at the moment in financial markets. But that's what we're looking forward to. That's what's coming next. Additional shocks to our system, either in terms of economic, financial, or geopolitical shocks, are on the table. This is what happens in a fourth turning because at this moment of great vulnerability, we're going to hit further points at which we realize we are unprepared for the future. A lot of the assumptions we're making actually aren't going to pan out. We need to retool our institutions in a much more fundamental way than we've seen thus far. That's exactly what happened in the 1930s, where we kind of ratcheted down our expectations and retooled things in a bigger and bigger way than FDR ever thought going in 1932 that he would ever have to do. That's where we're going to go. And that's going to lead to what we call the crisis. That's the third point in a fourth turning, when suddenly things get worse and worse, but we're beginning to match it with greater and greater civic effort. We're rebuilding our civic life to match this greater and greater sense of crisis. Then we reach the crisis and pass it, and then that leaves the final act in a fourth turning, and that's what we call the resolution. That's when the treaties are signed, the negotiations are made, all of the civic cement, which was wet during the fourth turning, suddenly dries. And then we suddenly have a post-crisis order, which hopefully would endure a beneficial and working post-crisis order. We hopefully will endure for the next 2 or 3 turnings after that, right? You see, that's how it worked. We came out of World War II, and this is just the most recent example with NATO, the UN, the World Bank, the IMF, Bretton Woods. You know, we came all these things which define the post-crisis world order. It didn't change very much for a long time. So history moves, public history moves very quickly toward the end of a fourth turning, the latter half of a fourth turning. That's what we're moving toward, and that's where we're going to go. The final point I want to make is this, is that people talk about fourth turnings, and I've been quoted in the media this way, that they're just bad, they're apocalyptic, they're horrible for all of us. And I just want to make the point that fourth turnings are actually necessary. Just like winter is necessary. Winter kills everything off so that new things can grow. And just as forests need fires, rivers need floods, so does society need events which clean out the debris, which clean out everything that's sclerotic and ossified that no longer functions. Something which tilts the whole playing field of power and wealth from the old back to the young. This is what fourth turnings do. They renew us. Fourth turnings are the price we must pay for a new golden age. History has shown this time after time, and we're about to see it again in what I expect to be a really interesting and fascinating period in our history with which we can truly be all engaged.